Hey everyone, welcome back to another AskGN. We shot 3 today. One of them is on the Patreon channel. If you go to patreon.com/gamersnexus, it's a bonus episode. The other ones, both, will be on this main channel, so you can check those out. If you have questions for next week, post them in the comment section below, and I'll try to get to them, though we do get quite a lot. We have some really good questions this time. One of them, my favorite one, I'm not going to be able to answer directly today, but it prompted a really cool interview that we'll have coming up, hopefully in the next week or so. And that is going to be about Intel's 10nm struggle, featuring hopefully David Cantor from Real World Tech. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA's 19th anniversary giveaway. EVGA is giving away over $80,000 of components in its retro-themed 19-year anniversary, including 2 signed GN mod mats, and also several full systems, GPUs, motherboards, and more. To participate, click the link in the description below to start EVGA's scavenger hunt, screenshot competition, or gaming events. Click the link below to learn more. All right, so before starting, quick news on everything. News update as always. We restocked our blueprint logos. If you were interested in them, they sold out twice. They're finally back. Hopefully they'll stay for a while now, or hopefully not, depending on your perspective. And we also have the mod mats are in stock and shipping now. So if you buy, they are actually going out the door as orders come in now. They're not back ordered anymore. Final item before we start. This poster's brand new. We really like the design of it. It's a video card anatomy poster. So it's just kind of cool if you want something that shows like MOSFETs, chokes, and all that kind of stuff, capacitors on it, and explains where they are on the board. We have them on the store, store.gamersnexus.net for all of those things. All right, let's get started properly. First question, I'm going to tell you what it is, and then we're going to come back to it in a few days. This question is from UncleCurseBurp, who asked, what do you think of Intel's struggle at 10nm and AMD moving to 7nm with TSMC? Intel's CEO had to resign over the 10nm struggle, and they may truly be in trouble with the constant 10nm delays in terms of AMD being able to deliver a more efficient product to the semi-custom market. For reference, here's a link. And they link a semi-accurate story. Not saying the story is semi-accurate, that's the name of the website. So David Cantor, if you haven't seen him on our channel before, we spoke with him about the sort of misnomer that is the phrase CUDA core. So we talked about what is really a CUDA core. Is it appropriate to call it a core? And we also have talked with him about CPUs, talked to them about the SSD market. So Cantor is a leading expert analyst. He is an actual technical analyst, not just a market analyst. He runs the website realworldtech.com. Doesn't get as many posts, but that's because each one is pretty in-depth. Previously wrote for Microprocessor Report and runs the Real World Tech forums as well. So Cantor is by all accounts an expert and can talk to this subject in a great way for our audience. So I asked him, do you want to contribute an answer for this episode? We got to talking about it and basically decided, you know what? Screw this. Let's just do a whole video on it, because it would have been only 2 to 3 minutes versus we can go full depth with a video. So we'll have him on just a Skype call pretty soon, hopefully. And quick quote from him when I was speaking on the phone with Cantor about this idea. He said, 10nm is a little bit of a mystery to everyone. What's the backup plan? So I think that's a pretty good hook for the interview we'll do later on. Subscribe if you want to catch that. Basically, I wish I had an answer for this episode, but I really would love to just do the full like 15-20 minutes on it rather than 3. So next, first real question, I guess. Does heat degrade CPUs more than pure voltage? And this was posted by Stephan Svendsen, who said, I've heard different things from different sources, but does heat degrade CPUs more than pure voltage put into the CPU? Phrased differently, can one safely input higher voltages into the CPU as long as the temperature is low, or will the high voltage degrade the CPU regardless of low temperatures? I reached out to both Roman, or Der Bauer, and Buildzoid about this. Roman will probably be talking with him separately. I don't know if it'll be a separate video or not, or if I'll just revisit it next week. But Buildzoid had an answer. He was immediately available. Der Bauer was busy with work. So Buildzoid said, and I'll expand on this on my own in a moment, but he said both are exponential, as in the rate of degradation at like 150 degrees Celsius is really, really fast compared to 100 degrees Celsius. Similarly, 2 volts might kill a chip instantly when compared to 1.75. So to expand on Buildzoid's answer, the reason I reached out to these extreme overclockers, XOCers, is because although I can speak to this from most practical standpoints, these guys are bringing CPUs under it's under liquid nitrogen. They're pushing high voltages. So they've got the really extreme version of the answer for you. So both are exponential, as Billzoid said. To expand on his answer, though, so does heat degrade CPUs more than just pure voltage? It depends on what part of the CPU you're talking about. If you're talking about the CPU core, that's one thing. Let's talk first about another component, though, the IMC, or the SoC on if you're talking AMD. So the integrated memory controller has its own voltage, and on Intel, the IMC, whenever you're working with, let's say, memory overclocking, you're having trouble stabilizing a memory OC, you might need to push your system agent voltage on Intel or your SoC voltage on AMD. Same idea overall, different names, slightly different, well, actually different applications as well, but same idea. So if you have to push the SA or the SoC voltages up, this is an instance where, although your temperatures could be perfectly fine and well within spec, pushing the voltage on either one of these two specific areas, the SoC or the IMC, can cause serious degradation on the IMC over time. So if you start pushing, let's say, 1.4 volts system agent on Intel, on modern Intel, like Skylake architecture and onward, then absolutely voltage will cause degradation on the CPU. Not the cores, but the memory controller. So pushing 1.4 SA over time to stabilize your memory overclock, eventually, and this could be a couple months, it could be 6 months, probably not longer than a year though. Almost certainly under a year if you're at 1.4 volts, probably within 6 months. But at some point, there will be degradation. And that degradation manifests in a primary way of either, well, mostly requiring more voltage now to sustain the same clock, or you're just not able to ever hit that clock again and you have to drop clocks but keep the same voltage, or you drop really hard and you lower the voltage to an appropriate, safer level. So that is one area where just pure voltage can cause serious degradation without necessarily having the heat component, at least not presented to you through core temperatures. Something else that's hot, but just the voltage plus the heat on that component where you can't get an IMC temperature in any software that I'm aware of. That's one component of your question. The other component is, yes, actually, for cores, for V core, it's a bit different. You can push pretty high voltages, and typically, under most normal user scenarios, which I'll define in a moment, typically you will hit a thermal limitation before you hit a deadly voltage. Typically, not always. So when I say normal user scenario, I mean it's not delidded. You didn't put liquid metal on it. It's out of the box thermals, as you might say, and pulling that CPU out of the box, putting it into a socket, and then putting a cooler on it that's maybe like 240 millimeters max for a radiator or an air cooler. Under those conditions, it's pretty likely that you are going to hit a thermal throttle scenario before you start hitting really seriously deadly V-core. And I mean, in most cases, we've tested with like Coffee Lake with a 6-core or something, you might hit thermal throttle at 1.42 volts, which is around where you kind of cut off for safety anyway. Maybe 1.45, which isn't all that much worse. But to start pushing any deadly amount of voltage is going to require more exotic cooling or delids and things like that. But there's still the other part of your question. Okay, so I'm not running a deadly voltage, but my temperature is really high. Well, for the most part, especially on Intel and AMD CPUs, they're a bit different. Intel CPUs have currently basically zero response to temperature except for am I throttling or not. It's binary. It's just basically a Boolean question of am I 100 degrees, or on some am I 105 degrees? If no, then let's just keep running the clock as high as it can. If yes, we'll drop it back until we sustain TJ max, or temperature junction max. And in those cases of Intel CPUs, you can run like 90 degrees pretty much without problems for a very long time. The degradation it's very difficult to plot. We don't have a real answer. It would take years and years of testing, dozens of CPUs at that sustained temperature to really know the answer. But 90 degrees is not that bad. Now, it's not a number people want to see generally. Even if it's just an OCD thing, you might want to see like 80 or something like that. But 90 is reasonable. It's just that, it's not a pleasing number. It's not killing your CPU literally though. And the voltage, in theory, if you're under like 1.42, is going to be fine as well for V-cores. Just watch out for SA and SoC. AMD's got a bit of a different temperature scale. Can't remember it off the top of my head because they have a few different swings. So like AMD's TDP suggests it's calculated partially on temperature, as you would expect, and because they are directly related. TDP for AMD assumes an optimal temperature of about 60.8 degrees Celsius for the cores, and beyond that point you start getting some derating sort of. TDP worsens, that's pretty normal. And also, their CPUs do have more issues sustaining overclocks once you get into the 80s, especially once you're into the 90s. So that doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean that AMD's worse or better than Intel. It means they approach it differently. So this particular aspect is not a better or worse. It's these things work differently. But to answer your question, well, I think I already did, but Bill Zoid's answer covers the extreme end with LN2 and extreme high voltages where, as he said, 2 volts might just straight kill a chip. But you're never going to hit 2 volts. You're not going to hit 1.75 volts either. It's very unlikely you'll even do 1.5 volts if it's not delated with liquid metal and you're not using some extreme cooler, like a giant water cooler or a chiller or something like that. So for the most part, you will probably thermal throttle before you kill something with voltage. That's not always true, though. See the entire rest of this answer for why. Hopefully that gives you a pretty good outline. I feel like that's fairly complete. There's definitely more there, but hopefully that helps. Next question, and our thanks to Bill Zoid from Actually Hardcore Overclocking, by the way, for helping with the answer. You can check him out, Actually Hardcore Overclocking on YouTube. Not to be confused with Actually Running Stock, which was his other side channel. Are mining GPUs safe to buy used? This is from Geimvera, who asked, now that mining rigs are being chopped up and sold off, are those GPUs safe to buy, or should they be avoided like the plague? Well, assuming it's not one of the ones that was hit by the flood in China. Let's just do that. Let's ignore those first. The idea of mining GPUs, so the concern here, I would assume, is, hey, this thing's been running 100% load for its whole life. Does that mean it's degraded in any serious way? And the answer kind of depends. Whenever you're talking used, obviously there are a million variables. We don't know what the owner did. I have no idea how well they took care of it, whatever. So any answer I give you is not going to be a blanket yes or no. As far as would I buy a mining GPU used, let's do that. If the price is significantly reduced and I feel like I have recourse as a buyer, then yes, I would consider a used mining GPU. However, I've got kind of my own personal idiomatic ways of, or idiosyncratic ways, I should say, of dealing with this stuff. So my idiosyncrasies for this kind of scenario, I always feel a little uneasy buying used, but that's not necessarily for a logical reason. It's just, I mean, it kind of is based on logic, but I like the idea of knowing that there's a warranty there. The component could fail for any reason. It might not even be the miner's fault. It might just have been eventually waiting to fail because there was something bad on it. So I don't personally like buying used parts if I can avoid it, but there's absolutely, totally an argument for why you should do it. We buy used stuff for business, like tables, chairs, all that stuff all the time. So I totally understand it. I don't want to say that you shouldn't. I'm just saying that keep my perspective in mind, which is that I feel uneasy doing it myself, which means that I feel really uneasy recommending anyone buy used, because if something happens, I don't want to be responsible for it. So with that disclaimer out of the way, you take on the risk, all that stuff. Let's talk about the real technical aspect of this. Technically, a mining GPU has been under maybe 100% load for its whole life. When a miner is presumably working in optimal scenarios, they should have the GPU under power target. So typically, miners will run 70, 80% power target, something like that. I don't know exactly, but it's below 100%. It's certainly not overclocked like 120% power, because you instantly lose all of the profit margin there on power. So they're running below power target. In theory, the fans are also running kind of fast. So hopefully if there is a dead component soon, it's going to be a fan, not like a cap or something. So in theory, the fans are running fast, power target's low, VRM shouldn't be too abused. The memory VRM might be a bit abused if they overclock the memory, and the memory VRM is weaker. That's certainly true on a lot of cards. The core VRM gets way more focus. So it's possible that the memory VRM got abused. It's possible that it ran a bit hot, but MOSFETs can take like 125 degrees Celsius before there's any real serious problems. Inductors, same thing. So then what components are we concerned about? Well, MOSFETs can pop, even though they can run high temperatures, but that might just be a bad batch. So it's really hard to draw a line distinguishing between mining abuse and was going to fail anyway. Capacitors are where your real concern is, especially anything that's kind of located in a hot spot on the card where there might not be airflow because the cooler design's bad. So this comes down to a lot of assumptions. Like, we're assuming that the cooler is pretty good to begin with. We're assuming that everything's getting decent airflow. We're assuming the miner was running it at maybe below the power target and thus below the temperatures. This is what you'll hear a lot from miners. It's, well, it was below the load that someone gaming would have it, and it's not thermal cycling, so it doesn't have the abuse of thermal expansion and contraction constantly through its life like it would with gaming. It was just 100% always on. And there's absolutely some truth to that. But it's also not quite that simple. So if you have a capacitor on the board that's not getting good airflow, and it was in a rack in China where there's not like necessarily, I mean, it's higher temperature, just ambient temperature is higher. Maybe they had a whole bunch of GPUs in a line, whatever. If it's in kind of poor conditions, it's possible that a capacitor could be running at 105 degrees Celsius. It's not too common. Capacitors tend to get decent cooling from the fans, but if that's the case, if it's a bad cooler, whatever, then absolutely you could buy a card that has a cap nearing end of life. 105 Celsius, maybe some caps are going to be 5,000 hours, something like that. So if you're running 24/7, 105C, it's going to die inside of like a year. But 105C is a whole lot, and it's not that common that caps get that hot. We typically see them in the 60s to 80s in like 100% load, 100% power target gaming scenario, or like a prime crunching type or a power virus scenario. So the answer to your question is this is really hard to answer, and there are a lot of things to consider, and we're making a lot of assumptions. One of them is that the cooler doesn't suck. If it's a card that has a bad cooler, and it was being used 100% of the time, even with reduced power consumption from miners who set it up properly, it could still be a risky buy. Because if the cooler's bad, it doesn't matter what the miners did. At some point, you've got stuff that's getting hot, even though they're not pulling as much power as normally, it's still in a higher temperature than your average room ambient temperature in most serious cases. So I don't know. I would say yes, it is worth considering buying a used mining GPU. There's a good chance that it was under less strain than a lot of used gaming GPUs in some instances, but in those instances where it was under more strain than the average gaming GPU, it was a hell of a lot more strain, so you're more likely to see a failure. It's just buy somewhere where you've got some buyer protection. I know there are going to be people who take issue with this answer because there are going to be people who are miners who feel, or people who bought used mining GPUs and say my anecdotal evidence suggests it's completely okay. And I agree with you. It's definitely completely okay if you get lucky, but it's also easy to get screwed over and you just don't know what you're buying. It doesn't have like a Carfax report or something like that. So until we have a way to know what you're buying, I feel uneasy suggesting it. But I would say that there's a good chance you're okay. It's just when it's not okay, it will be a catastrophic failure. And that's how GPUs fail, by the way. It's not like performance degradation. It's not going to be you buy a 1080 and it's performing like a 1070. It's going to be you buy a 1080 and it either works great and you never notice that it was used for mining, or it doesn't work. That's probably going to be the two modes you get. GPUs don't really degrade in performance like in gaming. They work fine until they don't. And that's because when they don't, it was a catastrophic failure. Capacitor died, MOSFET blew up, something like that. But anyway, in the very least, probably just replace the thermal paste. So hopefully I covered all my bases there and addressed most of the definitely going to be posted criticism of the answer. I'm sorry if you don't agree. I did my best to cover all possible angles of it. So hopefully I got the angle that you cared about. But anyway, that's you asked my opinion. That's how I feel about it. It's not a hard fact necessarily that you should or shouldn't buy one. Next one, Prime95 versus AIDA. So Devin Dykstra says, when I was overclocking my CPU, I noticed an odd phenomenon. When I overclocked it too high, Aida64 and Prime both crashed my system, but when I ran stress tests at the same time, it was stable. I would think that running both would put even more stress on the CPU. So what's going on here? They actually won't. You should only use one real stress testing program if it's going to pull 100% of resources for the component you're testing. So you should use either only Prime or only AIDA. I don't particularly like AIDA's stress testing test, so I would suggest most other things. Prime95, small FFTs. I would suggest Blender is a good one too. That's a realistic one. If you don't like Prime because it's not super realistic, Blender uses AVX. It's still really abusive. It's just not quite as abusive as small FFTs and Prime. So using both, you're going to run into an issue with thread scheduling where Windows is just bouncing between the two applications, and Windows basically sees two applications calling for 100% resources, and Windows is sitting there freaking out, trying to figure out how I can keep both of these applications running simultaneously. And so the solution is to do thread scheduling and to switch resources back and forth between them. So you're toggling stuff on and off, you're putting stuff in memory, you're pulling stuff out of memory, and all of that means that you have a lot of CPU downtime while Windows is trying to keep both applications running, rather than just saying, you know what, I can't handle this, I'm going to give all my attention to Prime, in which case you would have the first scenario you described. So what it's doing instead is it's trying to keep both running. You're getting the prioritization, the threads switching between the applications, memory is being used and dumped, and that means that you're going to end up with a sort of like false sense of stability. So just use one application. Next one is from FourthTuna, who says, can GN possibly review gaming mice? It's known in the cybersport enthusiast community that even among top-tier gaming mice sensors, button switches do differ and affect performance. Players collect data based on reviews and personal experience. There's a lack of expertise about sensors, their technology, and parameters. We've done a couple of videos with people like Chris Pate from Logitech, who's a great engineer and PM, about sensors. The trouble with reviewing mice, we used to do a lot of peripheral reviews, but we got out of it. And it's because they're so damn subjective. It's really hard to, as someone who these days tries to lean on data and data collection, it's hard to review something subjective and feel confident in my conclusion, because ultimately the thing with subjectivity is that people won't agree with you. And that's fine, but it's different when it's something like that personal, like a mouse, where like a game review. If you read game reviews and you think, I don't agree with that critic at all, that's fine. You don't have to like call them names for it. It's just that in the future, you know that you shouldn't be reading that critic because they might not like the same kinds of games as you do. So it's important for subjective reviews to find someone who has the same style as you and typically agrees with you, as opposed to what most of the internet thinks, which is that you need to be constantly at odds and adversarial with everybody. So mice reviews fall under that category. It's really hard to do right. There are ways to do technical testing. You can test the latency. You can test input response time. We've done it, but we worked with Logitech to do it, and we don't have a permanent setup for that. So I've thought about it. I would love to review mice in a technical fashion that's like repeatable way to collect data, but it's just not something we can do right now. Like, I mean, what are you going to do? Test button endurance and get a pneumatic arm to sit there and push the button 50 million times, and then you have one sample. So it's really hard to do, and we got out of it. But I'd love to look at mice again. It's just I don't have any present plans. That said, if you have ideas, I'm not a mouse enthusiast anymore. I don't have the time to be anymore. So if you kind of spend a lot of time on forums and you look at these user reviews of it, let me know what kind of data the people collect. Is it objective? If it's objective data that I could maybe collect myself, let me know, and we can look into it for next time. If it's subjective, let me know what that is too, but just know that I'm probably not going to test it, if it is. Two more. Good full tower cases. George Lambros says, hello, Steve. I hope you're doing well. I am. Thank you very much. I know you mostly cover mid-tower cases, but do you plan on reviewing some full tower cases as well? I made the mistake 6 years ago to buy the 800D, and now, since you educated me, I ripped the drive cage apart, put two 140 fans in the front, glued Silverstone Air filters on the front. That's cool. Now I have much better temperatures, but that means all my 7 drives are in the air, held by cables or sitting at the bottom of the case. I think it's time to upgrade. So, which one would you recommend except the HAF? Well, the HAF X is kind of old anyway, so I don't really feel great about recommending it anymore. But, okay, so I was reading the rest of this. So a few things here. I also have drives on the bottom of my case, and I shouldn't, but I do. You got a couple options. If you want to keep the full tower approach, which I completely get, I actually personally prefer full towers and use them myself, then there are a few options. The Dark Base Pro 900's out there, as you mentioned. That's one of the better ones we've looked at lately. The View 71 is a fairly big case. I guess it's not technically a full tower, and I don't remember how many drive cages it has. Sorry. But look into the View 71. It performed way better than we thought it would. And it is a full tempered glass case, but it has enough gaps that it actually performed pretty well. So that's also a big-ish case. Dark Base Pro 900 is for sure the biggest we've looked at lately. C700P, we actually decently liked the Cosmos C700P. I know a couple of other reviewers really didn't like it, and it is kind of clumsy to work with. If you want to invert it, I would just suggest not doing that. But it's a large case. It does have some not great airflow, but you can work around it with that one. That's the upside. Those are really, that's what I got for you. Case Labs, if you have a ton of money, like $500, you could buy a Case Labs case and never buy another case ever again. But they are expensive up front, and hopefully you get used out of it for a long time. They're also better for water cooling. So that's what I got in mind. We look at a lot of cases. I'm positive I'm forgetting full tower cases. I know I am. So for those of you who keep a good eye on full tower cases, please post them below so that George can take a look through your suggestions. But George, those are mine. It's basically look at Case Labs just so you know what's out there, but don't go in planning to buy one because they're expensive. Look at the Dark Base Pro 900. If you don't like it, that's fine, but I actually did quite like that case personally. The C700P is okay, but it's got some problems. And I'll think about others, but View 71 maybe. That's what I got for you right now, I think. Alternatively, you go mid-tower and get like a small box or build another small system and do a NAS and just do network attached storage. And then you could put it on a gigabit or 10 gigabit line. 10 gigabit's probably a bit expensive, so maybe gigabit. Locate it in your room with the router. And you've got network attached storage, and now you can have a smaller case. That's an alternative for you to think about. There are NASs that are sold for relatively cheap that are fairly all-in-one. Most of them won't have the failures we had recently. Last one, Ghostpilot. How often are you able to make it to a bike track? Do you bring your own bike or rent? Do you have a favorite? And is there one you are looking forward to visiting? So Whistler is probably one of my favorites. I get to go, there's a season, for downhill season, and it's typically like May, maybe June through like October. And at that point, all of the chairlifts close and it becomes winter parks, except for a couple of parks that are actually some not far from us that are year-round. So I try to bring my own whenever I can. If it's on the East Coast and I can access it by car, I definitely do that. I ride local jump lines. I don't know if we'll put a picture in, but I have photos of like giant jump tracks we have locally and stuff like that. So those are great, but they don't have chairlifts, so push the bike up, ride it down, do the jumps. Or local all mountain lines. So I get out pretty regularly for just like trail riding locally and jump tracks locally. A couple times a week I try to do for like an hour or so each time, hour or two, just to keep sane. It really helps me stay focused on the site. If I go out there and just do a bunch of jumps for like an hour and just do nothing but session jumps, it clears my head completely. Then I can think about what I want to accomplish for the day for the site. So as often as I can. Downhill riding requires driving or flying, but I do get out a good amount of weekends through the summer, and I bring two laptops. I'll edit a video or schedule them for posting and write articles while I'm there. So I still work like 4 to 8 hours a day, but that's a lot less than normally. So it's like a mini break, but not that much of one. And buying or renting, I try to bring my own bike if I can. If it's in like Whistler, like where I did the recent video, then I rent there because it's too expensive and there's a damage waiver, so I don't have to worry about damage because it's not my bike and there's a damage waiver. So favorite probably Whistler in Canada. I've ridden in Taipei. After Computex, I've gone twice now, and that's pretty fun. I like in Taoyuan. I like Mammoth in California, Snowshoe, Bryce, Bailey I don't like that much, but yeah, those are my top picks. So anyway, that's it for this one. As always, subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to get the bonus episode, and go to store.gamersnexus.net. The mod mats are in stock and shipping now. These shirts are in stock. The keychains are finally back in stock. The crystals are finally back in stock. You guys bought everything. Thank you very much. We finally restocked them all. Really happy to see that people love the stuff and are buying it. And then the posters are brand new and in stock as well. So thank you for the continued support. We sincerely appreciate it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.